Okay, so our clay is centered. You can see it looks fairly still. If I spin the wheel, it looks like it's nice and still on the sides. It doesn't have to be perfect, really. It's a process of the clay moving off and on center as we throw. We just want to start with it as centered as possible. I'm now going to make sure my hands are nice and wet. I've been going quite fast. I didn't mention that when I was centering, but when you're centering, you want to have your speed of your wheel spinning really fast. And now for the rest of the throwing, we're gonna start slowing down. So I'm gonna drill my hands into the center of the clay, down just into the center, but I'm gonna make them in my index fingers into a slight V shape, so that you can see there's a nice wide opening there. I can then measure how thick my base is by putting a needle into the bottom and then using my finger against the base. There I can see how thick my base is. So that's quite good. If my base is at least as thick as a finger, I can do a really nice foot in there. So don't go too thin with your bases. Okay, once I've gone down as deep as I want, I'm going to get my 2 index fingers inside and hook them. So making a little hook with my fingers towards me, pulling the clay out towards me. So you can see now I've got a nice donut of clay here that's going to become the wall of the pot. But for now, I'm just spreading the base out. That's all I'm doing. It's really important your foundation, your base of your pot is always the weak point and your rim. So I'm going to speak to you about compressing your rim later, but for now, before we pull the clay up and we can't get back down here, we need to make sure our foundation is nice and strong. So I'm going to compress the base by running my fingers from the center out. This just helps to even out the clay particles and bind them together so that water can't get in there too much, as we throw a lot of water onto the pot as we go. So bringing your hand in, pressing your hand out, your fingers, sorry. In and out. Just doing that a couple of times, so now I've got a nice strong foundation. I can then collar the clay in slightly. The clay is going to constantly want to throw itself off the wheel because of this working on the wheel with the centrifugal force. So we're going to try and aim for more of a conical shape, and then at the end open it up into a nice straight walled cylinder. So always just try and think of countering that. So before I pull my clay up, I want to make sure it's nice and tight and in the center. You can think of your wheel head as a clock, and you've got 12 o'clock there, 3 o'clock here, 6 o'clock here, 9 o'clock here. Everything we do from now on is going to be between 3 and 6 o'clock. We're going to try and always work on the right-hand side of the pot because the wheel spins anti-clockwise, and we want the clay to pass through our hands. If I were to work at 9 o'clock, the clay is going to be hitting my hands, and it's going to be difficult to keep it in control. There might be times where we do that, but for now, we're going to work at 3 o'clock. So starting with your dove hands, making like a W or dove shape. Again, everything's about connectivity. So the reason for that is that if my hands are connected, they have coordinates against each other. And I'm going to drop my left hand on the inside, my right hand on the outside, and squeeze the clay up between my fingers. I'm going to really try and just use my fingertips for the squeezing process. Make sure it's nice and lubricated. Make sure I've got dove hands, so my hands are connected. Left hand on the inside, right hand on the outside, and squeezing the clay lightly up between my fingertips. I'm going very slow with the wheel and just lifting that little donut of clay, squeezing it all the way up to the top. When I get to the top, it helps to almost imagine that the top is further than where it ends. So I'm almost going to imagine my fingers lifting and squeezing beyond the end of the cylinder, so that I don't end with a finishing flourish, which often happens for beginners because you're excited, you've made it to the top and you do that. So really think about how you're lifting your hands off of the pot. Do it nice and gently, and we want to make sure we get that clay evenly pulled all the way to the top. Otherwise, if this is too thick, this won't be able to, this will be thinner and it won't be able to support this. So really nice, even all the way to the top finish. I'm going to then color it back into center, because as I said, it's a process of it being off and on center. So now we might have moved it off slightly. Coloring is just wrapping your hands around the clay and bringing it back into center. And then, as I mentioned, your rim is also always your weak point, because we're throwing so much water onto that point. So, and it also is where the wonks get worked out. So in order to try and keep everything nice and controlled, we're going to compress it. But again, I never do anything with just one hand, so I'm not going to just compress it with one finger. I'm going to support the walls with my fingers, my left hand, and then press down with my finger of the right hand, and this makes like a little H shape. Okay, so I'm going to do my next pull, make my W or my dove hands. Helps a lot to make a little divot at the bottom so that you've got something to hook your fingers into. So I've just pressed the clay in there slightly, and then I drop my left hand in, my right hand works from the outside, my hands are connected, my elbows tucked slightly into my waist so that I'm really nice and controlled, and squeezing the clay up between my fingers, watching that the speed of my hands match the speed of the wheel. So I want to go a full rotation of the wheel before I move up to the next level. So let the clay move a full rotation and get nice and even between your fingers where you're squeezing, and then spiral your way up to the next level. So it's a really slow and controlled movement. Imagining that the clay continues beyond the rim, lifting my hands off nice and slowly. So now I can compress or color first, it doesn't matter. So compressing is my little H shape, pushing the clay down from the top, and then coloring it in. And one more time, make sure my hands are wet, make sure the wall of the pot is wet, make a little divot on the outside so I've got something to get my hands into, and then lifting that clay from the bottom, squeezing between my fingers. You'll have to play around with which fingers work for you. I find that my middle finger and my index finger on the inside are the ones that are pressing against each other, but everyone's hands are shaped differently, so you'll have to play with this. Try not to do what I just did and stop halfway. What you need to do is try and have a really smooth, controlled pull that goes all the way from the bottom to the top in one motion. Okay, I don't want to see you doing this. Lots of pulls. That is one sure way to make sure your clay goes off center. So even if it's feeling a bit wobbly, just try and consistently work your hands up from the bottom to the top, and just letting that wonk work out. When you get to the top, lifting off gently, coloring it back in, compress from the top. If my top has gone off center, a way to deal with that is to needle it off. So needle off this top little section, because sometimes the rest of your pot is perfectly on center, but this might be throwing you off. So to needle through, I'm going to pinch the wall of the pot slightly and guide the needle against my thumb towards my index finger and hold still. Like that. Then lifting this top little ring off, compressing, and then I can start again. So I'm fairly happy with the evenness of my walls now. They feel nice and even from the bottom up. There'll always be a little bit more weight sitting at the bottom. We need that weight there in order to hold all of this while it's still so wet. And then in our second part of the process, we'll trim that away. So for now, you're going to look at your inside shape, using the side plane of your index finger, running both index fingers opposite each other to make a nice straight shape. So now we're just working on the shape and getting it nice and even from the bottom up. Why I say the inside shape is that tomorrow we're going to look at trimming this away, and then that shape must match the inside shape. But you'll understand when you get to trimming what I mean by that. Happy with my pot, so now I'm going to clean it up. Running a kidney along the wall, all the way up. This just takes the slurry off. This is called slurry. And I can give get a sponge on the stick on the inside. It's really important to get all that water out. If there's any water sitting inside, it will keep seeping through the clay and cause cracks. My chamois cloth, make sure it's wet, and lightly drape it over your rim. You want your chamois to almost take the shape of your rim before you put it on. So I'm making it into a little, what kind of shape? In shape. Over the top, and just lightly holding it there, so this just stops it from being any sharp edges. And then it really helps with your trimming process to get rid of the skirt here. So I'm going to use what I call the dagger tool to literally, like a dagger, slide that into the side of your pot and cut that away into a little bit of an undercut. This will help you with wiring it off the wheel and help you with trimming the next time. Just that bottom little edge. Okay, now we're going to take the pot off the wheel. Get your wire. Make sure you really pull it nice and taut. So really nice, strong pull. If it's too long, the wire, you can wrap it around your fingers, kind of like when you floss, and push away from you wiring through. Try and have your fingers as close to the pot as possible as well to get it to move, and wire slowly. This will also help it to move. Okay, it's starting to move already, so you might not need to do this in that case, but it does help to have a bit of water in front and behind, because usually they're a bit more stubborn than that. So taking my wire and pulling that water all the way from the back of the wheel through underneath, so the water gets forced under the pot, and then it should start sliding. And you really need to make sure you've got water on your wheel so that it can continue sliding off onto a bat. I've got a bit of newspaper here. This will help to stop the pot from sticking and cracking as it shrinks. The shrinking process of your pot will begin as soon as it starts drying. So while it's wrapped in plastic, we want it to be sitting on newspaper. And in order to slide it onto this, we need to make sure the newspaper is nice and wet. Okay, so really wet the whole newspaper, and wet it well, and make sure that it's wet all the way to the edge, so that where I'm going to slide the pot onto the bat, it's going to be able to slide along that wet passage. I'm going to hold my bat flush with the wheel and use my fingers to just nudge the pot along onto the wheel. If your paper bunches up like that, there might not have been enough water on there, but as long as it's sitting comfortably on the bat, that's fine. And then we have a cylinder.